Hello and welcome to the programme which looks at the Holy Land. I am Paul Calvert. Psalm 91 verse 2 from the New King James Bible says this: I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust.
I'm with Jonathan Turner from UK Lawyers for Israel. Now, Jonathan, what is UK Lawyers for Israel?
So it's an organisation of lawyers, and we have two main areas of activity. One is that we invoke laws to try and stop improper, unlawful anti-Israel activity and anti-Semitism. And secondly, we try and explain the law relating to Israel and Israel's rights and the rights of the Jewish people under international law and also considerations of national law that may affect what people do. For example, when it comes to things like boycotts and refusing to give a platform to anyone who may have been to Israel in the past or whatever they do. So we have an educational side and an action side, if you like. Although I should perhaps say this, that we primarily focus on persuading people who really do want to comply with the law. We try and draw their attention to the applicable law and the facts which perhaps the management may not be aware of in an organisation, and maybe someone further down the line that's doing something that's wrong. And we alert the senior management. It might be a council, or it might be a company, or it might be a cultural organisation, whatever. We draw attention to the problem and why we say that what's going on is wrong, or why other people are demanding that the organisation do, like not hold a lecture or not buy products or whatever it might be. We explain why that might be unlawful and hope that they will comply with the law. And we try and avoid litigation if we can. We try and get things done by correspondence.
Some of the stories you're running at the moment, one of the stories just recently, a private prosecution of an Israeli soldier with dual citizenship was thrown out. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, so the UK has a rather old law from 1870 which says several things, but one particular provision says that it is a criminal offence for a person who is a British subject to accept a commission to engage in the armed forces of a foreign state that is at war with another foreign state that is at peace with Her Majesty being Queen Victoria, but when the Act was passed, but now, of course, it would be King Charles. So an Israeli was temporarily in England on the 7th of October 2023 when Hamas committed the appalling atrocities, and he had served in the IDF for his mandatory 3 years and was a reservist, as many Israelis are. Anyone who serves in the IDF following the service is a reservist and remains engaged in the IDF for the next 20 years or so. So he immediately returned to Israel to join his unit in accordance with the order for general mobilization that had been issued immediately following the Hamas attacks. It's the Tzav Shimoni, order number 8. So that's what he did, and he mentioned this in a post on social media that he was returning to Israel. And as a result, some people who seek to undermine Israel noticed this and sought to prosecute him as a private prosecutor. They did actually try and get the police to prosecute, but the police weren't willing to do so. So they applied to the magistrates' court to issue a summons requiring this Israeli to come back to the UK and attend the magistrates' court in order to be charged with this rather out-of-date criminal offence. And we got to hear about this. In fact, someone contacted us on behalf of the soldier, and as a legal organisation, association of lawyers who are supportive of Israel, of course we do have members who are very well-qualified specialists, both solicitors and barristers, in this case specialists in criminal law, and were therefore able to, or at any rate are members were able to offer assistance to this Israeli. They also instructed a quite independent leading counsel, Peter Wright KC, who is a very senior barrister specialising in criminal law. And so there was Daniel Burke, who's a very good solicitor in Manchester, specialising in criminal law, has acted for members of Parliament in both major UK parties, Conservatives and Labour, when they've been in difficulty, when they've been charged with criminal offences. I think one was charged and another one was under investigation. But anyway, he dealt successfully with both of those cases and a number of other high-profile cases. So very good solicitor. And Natasha Hausdorff, who is a superb oral advocate, superb speaker on international law. Many of your audience, of the people who read your articles, will know of Natasha Hausdorff in Israel. She was given the honour of lighting one of the torches on Mount Herzl on Israel's Independence Day last year, in recognition of the work that she has done to explain Israel's legal rights and the law relating to Israel. So they represented this soldier, and they did so very successfully indeed. The application was thrown out by a very strong judgment, which found that it was misconceived in law, unsubstantiated by relevant evidence, and was an abuse of process, bearing in mind in particular the lack of candour with which it was brought. The prosecution has a duty to be totally honest and to put and act in an impartial way towards the court, putting both sides of the argument before the court. They certainly didn't do that. One of the things they omitted to mention was that government ministers have repeatedly been asked, both Conservative and Labour, have been asked whether this act applies to joint British-Israeli nationals, or indeed Israeli nationals who return to join the IDF. And the British government has said, no, it doesn't. So that's been repeated on at least a dozen occasions in Parliament in recent years. And such mention as a prosecutor made about this was so misleading. They said, well, they did mention that, but that was because Palestine was not recognised by the British government as a state, and now it is, and that changes everything. But it's quite clear that these statements continued even subsequently, and it was never part of the reason given, and it was irrelevant. At that point, it was irrelevant to this case because the prosecution was saying, well, Israel is at war with Syria and with Lebanon and with Iran, and so that's nothing to do with whether Palestine is a state or not. So they dealt with, and then they didn't mention most of the statements that had been made. They only mentioned one of them. So that was thoroughly misleading, and they were also misleading on other things. And they had an expert witness who delivered a long written diatribe, I think it's fair to say, about Israel, full of false allegations and completely one-sided. And again, expert evidence is supposed to be presented by an impartial person, impartially. And this particular expert was on some WhatsApp group organised by prosecutor. So was connected, if you like, with the prosecutor's operation rather than being an independent expert as portrayed. And the whole thing was quite obviously politically animated, that they weren't serious about actually having a successful prosecution. They were really trying to make a political point rather than use the criminal law for its proper purpose. So the whole thing was completely thrown out, and the judgment was published without identifying the accused or the proposed respondent, proposed defendant, and people can read a copy actually on our website if they want, which goes into the case in considerable detail.
Wow. So this could have actually opened a huge can of worms if this would have been allowed to proceed, wouldn't it, for anyone who is maybe a British citizen and comes to fight in the IDF?
Yes, and indeed, most extraordinarily, in order to establish that the accused was a British subject. Now, he was a dual national, British and Israeli. He had grew up in the UK and made Aliyah to become an Israeli citizen, but retained his British nationality. So that's a very common situation. Now, one of the reasons why this act is very out of date and obsolete is because so much has changed since the Victorian era. When the act was passed, the British subject meaning of that term was quite clear. It was anyone who was resident in the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And it caught people across the world. Now, this doesn't, and it was very much a binary thing. You were either a British subject or you were a foreign subject. There wasn't much dual citizenship, if any, around at that time. But fast forward to 2026 or 2025 or even 2023 when these events, the alleged offence was committed. And Britain is a rather smaller country, and a major political issue over the last decades in Britain has, of course, been the question of how much immigration Britain should allow. One of the factors there being that a lot of people could claim to be British subjects or something like that from all around the world who might be interested in coming to Britain to make their way, if I can put it that way. And this has been a controversial subject. And in order to deal with this, the term British subject has been completely redefined in legislation from 1948 onwards, and new categories have been created. So you now have things like UK citizen, who are sort of people who are entitled to reside in the UK, and British subject has been consigned to a relatively small category. But in order to deal with existing legislation, the British Nationality Act of 1982 said that where you find the term British subject in older legislation, this has the same meaning as Commonwealth citizen. Now, Commonwealth citizen has, and that's what the prosecution tried to latch onto. So they said, well, he, as a British citizen, he is a Commonwealth citizen, because Commonwealth citizen includes citizens of India, Pakistan, Cyprus, UK, whatever, Canada, Australia, all the rest. So they said that, well, he's a Commonwealth citizen because he's a British citizen, and that brings him into the meaning of British subject for the purpose of the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1870. The problem that they had was that if that's right, then all the citizens of India and all the citizens of Pakistan and all the citizens of Cyprus are British subjects within that meaning. And if that's the case, then everyone who enlists in the Indian army when India is at war with Pakistan, and everyone who enlists in the Pakistani army when Pakistan is at war with India, and anyone who enlists in the Cyprus army when Cyprus is at war with Turkey, they all commit offences under UK law, which will be quite totally ridiculous. So the court said that this is an impossible extension of the law, and they invoked, there was a proviso to the provision that said that British subject, it has the same meaning as Commonwealth citizen. There was a proviso which said that unless the context otherwise requires, and they said, well, quite clearly here, the context does otherwise require, because otherwise this legislation would be a massive overreach of British jurisdiction, with meaning that the police have a duty to arrest any Indian who comes to Britain who joined the Indian army at a time when India was at war with Pakistan, which of course has happened at various points. So that's, sort of the ramifications don't actually stop with Israel, but it would have been troublesome certainly for many people who joined the Israel Defence Forces as well.
Now, another story you've been involved with is an art gallery has cancelled a controversial Matthew Collings exhibition due to alleged anti-Semitism. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this exhibition was truly horrible. This guy was quite a well-known art critic. He does these drawings that are very sort of childish in a way. I mean, I don't know whether you call it art or not. Basically, they're sort of very primitive and cartoonish. But they show the most appalling anti-Semitic tropes. I mean, there's one of the director of Sotheby's eating a baby, saying, I'm eating a baby, in the speech bubble, I'm eating a baby while selling a very expensive painting. And it had Netanyahu gushing blood, and it had lots of swastikas and stars of David, shields of David, and soldiers surrounded by dead babies, Israeli soldiers with Star of David on their helmet and things like that. Absolutely ghastly exhibition full of anti-Semitic tropes. And so it was on show in Thanet in Essex for a while, this exhibition, and we managed to get the council to stop advertising it, but we didn't get the gallery to take it down. But then they booked a gallery in London, in the Hammersmith area, to hold the exhibition. We assume it was the same exhibition, containing the same paintings or works of art, if one can call it that. And we wrote to them, and we wrote to the chief executive of the parent company, and he wrote back drawing attention to the exhibition and the fact that it had been subject of coverage in leading UK newspapers, saying how appallingly anti-Semitic it is. And the chief executive wrote back very promptly, thanking us for drawing it to his attention. He wasn't aware that this had been booked. In fact, the management wasn't aware that it had been booked at all, and were not going to accept it. So that's dealt with that. I'm afraid to say that one of the reasons why this is pernicious is because these lies about the way the Israeli forces have attempted to deal with the totally evil Hamas organisation have been so misrepresented in the UK and around the world that a lot of people believe these things, and people seeing these or other allegations of this nature about Israel and Israelis, some of them, it only has to be 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, are so moved by this that they go around stabbing anyone who they associate with Israel, which includes ordinary Jewish people doing their shopping in Golders Green in London or attending synagogue in Manchester, etc. So this is a serious and present danger to us in Britain and, of course, elsewhere around the world.
It seems that an attack, the anti-Semitism that's in this, of course, can actually go out and cause, and we've just seen today the fact that in Golders Green there's been the two people who have been stabbed in this anti-Semitic attack. So it is really important for you to be able to stop this anti-Semitism being spread, because this is partly a result from it, not necessarily from this particular event, but when people are seeing things like this on the streets, it sort of reminds you of 1930s Germany, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and that is the worry. And I think this is having an impact on the Jewish community in the UK. People who thought would never contemplate emigrating from the UK are now here. Either have left or are arranging to leave. I think this is very unfortunate for Britain. The Jewish community here in Britain has contributed a lot to the economy, to the arts, to culture, to science. And I think it's a loss to Britain and terrible for the Jewish community and a terrible state of affairs. Those of us who are still here, at least in my case, not all the time, but some of the time, we are advised to take quite significant precautions. Again, sort of like the early stages of the Nazi era in Germany.
It seems very sad that you have to hide your Jewishness. Obviously, the people today, I think they were Haredi Jews, so I guess they were dressed in black, so they were very obvious and openly Jewish. But it does seem sad that, if someone wears a kippah or a Star of David, that they would maybe have to hide that fact just because they're in the UK and in Great Britain at this time.
Yes, Jews have mezuzot on their doorposts as a sort of practical implementation and a reminder of the injunction in the Bible to bind these words to your doorposts. And obviously it has a figurative meaning that this is how you must treat guests. But also it's taken, if you like, literally, and that literal taking of it reminds one. But in Britain, until now, people have had their mezuzot on the outside of their doors. I remember someone in France telling me one difference between France and Britain in terms of the Jewish community is that in France we have our mezuzot on the inside of our doors because of the past history of France under Nazi rule, whereas in Britain you have yours on the outside of your doors. Well, I'm afraid we might have to be thinking more in terms of the way they do things in France in future, which again, in itself is perhaps not so bad, but it's a reflection of a terrible situation.
Yeah, very sad because of what it means. Now, UK Lawyers for Israel have warned the University and College Union. Tell us about what you've been doing there.
Yes, so there is a resolution that's been put forward to the National Conference, which takes place, I think, at towards the end of May, if I remember rightly. But you're corrected if I've got that wrong. There are quite a lot of resolutions that are put forward, and certainly in the past, in fairness to the management of the University and College Union, where those resolutions have been actually discriminatory against Jewish people or Israelis or otherwise unlawful, they have actually intervened to either to remove them from the agenda or alternatively to state that they will not be implemented by the executive. Now, the UCU has a general policy which is very anti-Israel. But under UK law, unions have wide powers to adopt political policies. That arises out of the history of the struggle for workers' rights in the UK, because workers were rather downtrodden in the Victorian era and the early 20th century, and the courts kept finding against unions. And so the unions formed the Labour Party in order to ensure that the law was changed and maintained in a way that allowed effective union action representing workers. And one of the consequences of that is that there are very wide powers of unions and immunities in terms of their political activities. So we can't object to their political activities. And indeed, of course, in more modern times, there's freedom of speech considerations as well. But when they engage in activities, when unions engage in activities that actually disadvantage people in protected groups, minorities and so on, or other characteristics that are protected, when the people are discriminated because of their membership of protected groups, that is unlawful. Unlawful in the field of work. And this motion was about, it said that every effort must be made to stamp out Zionists and Zionist groups and so on and stop them operating at universities. The University and College Union is the union for staff of universities, academic staff of universities. So basically, this would discriminate against Jewish people, whether Jewish by religion or Jewish by ethnic origin, certainly indirectly, because most Jews are actually Zionists in the sense of believing that there should be a state of Israel and that the Jewish people is entitled to a state in their historic homeland and to self-determination in their historic homeland. So this would bear more on Jewish people. It would certainly discriminate against Israelis, who are most likely to be Zionists, but also against most Jewish people. So it was unlawful on that ground, but also we consider, and case law supports this, that Zionism is a protected characteristic, because protected characteristics include philosophical belief. And philosophical belief has been defined in a case called Nicholson and Granger and Nicholson rather, and the various characteristics that are required. And Zionism does tick all the boxes. And interestingly, there was a case called McElhenney against the Ministry of Defence, where someone who was a Scottish nationalist sued the Ministry of Defence for allegedly discriminating against him by refusing to employ him in certain roles because he supported Scottish independence. So we say, well, if supporting Scottish independence is a protected characteristic, then supporting Israeli independence is also a protected characteristic. And then, of course, we had Professor David Miller, a lecturer at Bristol University, was sacked because of nasty remarks he made targeting Zionist students. And he said, well, you're sacking me because I'm an anti-Zionist. And he succeeded in the Employment Tribunal. Now, that case went on appeal, and we haven't yet had the appeal court judgment, so we don't know exactly what that might say. But certainly the Employment Tribunal judgment said, well, anti-Zionism, as in the form that's been presented to us, I should say that Professor Miller described his views in a way that does not entirely accord with some of the things that he has written and said. So there may be a certain amount of room for argument about the Employment Tribunal's handling of the case, and the appeal by the university might well succeed. But at any rate, it was held that anti-Zionism of some kinds was a protected characteristic, and on that basis, so should Zionism be a protected characteristic. And this UCU motion would discriminate against Zionists. In fact, its object is to discriminate against Zionists, and therefore, in our view, it's unlawful. And that's what we've told the Union Secretary-General.
It's great that you're keeping Jews safe in the UK at this very difficult time by the work that you're doing. What is your website for people who'd like to know more about some of the other stories that you're working with to help keep Jews safe?
So it's www.uklfi.com. That stands for UK Lawyers for Israel. So the F is F for Freddie in that. And we have another website at uklficharity.com. We have two entities because some of our work is charitable and some of it is not. And so we have two organisations so that we can do both, because frankly the work is quite closely connected. But the charity assists people who are victims of anti-Semitism and also does our educational work. But some of our other work might be said to be a bit more political than that, and therefore is done by the non-charity. So we have two websites, uklfi.com and uklficharity.com.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for sharing today, particularly during these difficult times, and we pray that you'll be safe there in the UK in London.
Thank you, and thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. Pray that God will move by his mighty power in the Holy Land and bring his peace.